For years, Barron Trump was the one member of his family who remained a mystery. While his father dominated headlines, his older siblings engaged in media battles, and the world dissected every move of the Trump dynasty, Barron chose a different path. Silence. No interviews, no outbursts, no late-night social media rants. Just a towering young man, always in the background, watching, listening, waiting. Some called it disinterest, others called it strategy. And then, one night, under the unforgiving lights of the spotlight with Jonathan Blake, everything changed. Jonathan Blake wasn't just any journalist. He was a veteran, a master of television's high-stakes verbal chess, a man who built his reputation by making powerful figures squirm on live TV. His interviews weren't just conversations. They were battlegrounds. Presidents, billionaires, Hollywood elites all had walked into his studio thinking they were in control, only to leave dismantled, exposed, broken down by his relentless questions. So when it was announced that Barron Trump, Trump's most elusive heir, had agreed to an interview with Blake, the media exploded. Why now? Why him? Was this the moment Barron would finally break his silence? Was he stepping into the political spotlight? Or was he just another privileged name looking for attention? Blake saw this as an opportunity to challenge, to expose, to push Barron into a corner and force a reaction. The audience expected it, a young man inexperienced in the public arena, sitting across from one of the sharpest interrogators in the country. They expected him to fold. But they were wrong, because Barron Trump wasn't just another interviewee. And tonight, he wasn't the one being played. He was the one playing the game. The cameras rolled, the red live sign flashed. The studio, sleek and modern, pulsed with an electric tension as millions of viewers tuned in across the country. This wasn't just another political interview. It was a moment in history unfolding in real time. Jonathan Blake sat across from Barron Trump, his signature smirk barely concealed beneath the weight of years of experience. He had faced world leaders, CEOs, and media moguls. He had brought giants to their knees with nothing but words. And tonight, he had a new target. The last Trump son. For the first few moments, the exchange was calm, almost polite. Blake leaned back in his chair, his body language relaxed but predatory, the kind of confidence that came from knowing he had never lost a verbal battle on his show. "You know, Barron," he started, his voice smooth, calculated, the opening move in a well-rehearsed game. "For years, your family has dominated the headlines. Your father, your brothers, your sister, they've all embraced the media, taken the heat, defended themselves. But you've stayed silent." A pause. A perfectly timed silence to let the words sink in. A classic Blake maneuver. "Why now?" he asked, eyes locked onto Barron's like a lion sizing up its prey. "Why come here? To this studio, to my show? What changed?" The audience leaned in. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The first crack in Barron's armor, the hesitation, the nervous fidgeting, the slip-up. But it didn't come. Instead, Barron Trump, tall, composed, completely unfazed, leaned forward just slightly, locking eyes with Blake. His expression was unreadable, but there was something behind it, a quiet confidence that felt dangerous. "Nothing changed," Barron said, his voice steady, controlled. "I didn't come here for you, Jonathan. I came here for the people watching." The studio went dead silent. Jonathan Blake's smirk faltered for the briefest of moments. So fast, most people wouldn't have noticed. But Barron did. Blake quickly recovered, shifting tactics. If he couldn't rattle Barron with a direct challenge, he'd go for something closer to home. "You know," Blake said, smoothly transitioning, "your mother has always been an enigma. Elegant, poised, but quiet. Unlike other first ladies, she chose not to engage in the political battlefield. Some would say she avoided it altogether." Barron's posture didn't shift, but something flickered in his eyes. A warning. Blake saw it, and he pressed harder. "Do you think silence is a sign of strength, Barron? Or is it just convenient?" A murmur rippled through the audience. This was it. The trap. Blake had spent years perfecting these moments. Pushing just enough, making it seem like a fair question, while simultaneously planting the idea that silence was weakness. A lesser interviewee would have stumbled, denied, gotten defensive. But Barron Trump was not a lesser interviewee. His expression remained cool, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that no one expected. "Convenient?" he repeated, almost amused. "You think silence is easy?" Blake nodded slightly, ready to strike again. Well, isn't it? And then Barron struck first. You make a living with words, Jonathan, he said, voice calm but sharp as a blade. You sit in that chair, night after night, deciding who gets to be heard and who doesn't. You craft narratives, steer conversations, pick and choose which voices matter. The audience collectively held their breath. This was not the direction they thought the interview would go. But tell me something, Barron continued, tilting his head slightly, his gaze never leaving Blake's. If my mother had been loud, if she had fought back, made speeches, challenged the media, you think she would have been treated any better? Blake opened his mouth, but Barron wasn't finished. Or would she have been torn apart just the same? Boom. The studio froze. Even the crew behind the cameras felt it. The balance of power in the room had just shifted. Jonathan Blake was a professional, but even he knew when a conversation had turned against him. He had walked into this thinking he was the one in control. But Barron Trump had just rewritten the rules. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Blake was the one playing defense. For a split second, Jonathan Blake hesitated. It was almost imperceptible, just a flicker of uncertainty in his usually razor-sharp demeanor. But Barron saw it, and the audience saw it too. Blake had expected to control the conversation, to dictate the pace, to put Barron Trump on the defensive. But Barron wasn't playing that game. Instead, he had turned the question back on him, challenging the very integrity of the media's narrative about his mother. Jonathan wasn't about to let that slide. He sat up straighter, adjusting his suit jacket, his smirk returning. Calculated, predatory. If Barron wanted to make this a debate, he'd oblige, and this time he'd go straight for the jugular. You're saying the media would have torn her apart either way? Blake asked, his voice smooth but edged with something sharper. That no matter what she did, she was destined to be a victim? The word victim hung in the air, heavy, deliberate. Barron didn't move, didn't blink, but something in his posture shifted. A tension, a storm building beneath the surface. Blake saw it, and he pressed in. Let's be honest, Barron, Blake continued, his tone turning colder. Your mother didn't just choose silence, she chose irrelevance. A sharp murmur swept through the audience. Some gasped, others nodded in agreement. This was the attack they had been waiting for. Blake wasn't done. He leaned forward, eyes locked onto Barron's, pushing, digging deeper. She had a platform, a voice, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to inspire and lead, he said, his words hitting like hammer strikes. And what did she do with it? A shallow anti-cyberbullying campaign? A few public appearances in designer coats? She wasn't silenced. She just didn't have anything to say. The temperature in the studio skyrocketed. Even the most seasoned journalists in the audience felt the weight of that statement. It was brutal, unfiltered. It was designed to shatter Barron's composure, but Barron did not break. Instead, he smiled. Not a full grin, not arrogance, just the barest hint of amusement, like a chess player who had just seen his opponent make a critical mistake. Blake frowned, sensing something shift, and then Barron spoke. Calm, precise, lethal. You think my mother was irrelevant? He asked, his voice so steady it sent a chill through the room. Blake leaned in. Wasn't she? And then? Barron Trump dismantled the entire argument in one sentence. If she was so irrelevant, why are we talking about her right now? The silence was deafening. Blake froze. The audience froze. Even the camera crew, trained professionals who had seen some of the most intense debates in political history, held their breath. Because Barron had just flipped the entire premise of the attack. Jonathan had called Melania Trump irrelevant, but here he was, one of the most powerful journalists in the country, devoting an entire segment of his show to her. The irony was too sharp to ignore. Blake clenched his jaw, but before he could pivot, Barron kept going. You say she didn't have a voice, Barron continued, his tone still measured, but now carrying an unmistakable edge. But what you really mean is, she didn't say what you wanted her to say. Blake stiffened. Let me ask you something, Jonathan, Barron pressed, now fully in control. If my mother had spent 4 years attacking my father, calling him out, aligning with the media narrative, would you be sitting here calling her irrelevant? Boom. Because he knew the answer. Everyone knew the answer. If Melania Trump had attacked her own husband, she would have been hailed as a hero. She would have been put on magazine covers, invited to talk shows, celebrated as a woman who broke free. But she didn't. She stayed silent, dignified, refused to play the game, and for that, the media despised her. Blake was scrambling now, trying to regain footing. That's not what I... But Barron wasn't finished. You call her cyberbullying campaign shallow? He asked, his tone still deadly calm. Maybe it wasn't the most aggressive initiative in history, but tell me something, Jonathan. Barron paused, then delivered the knockout punch. Are you upset that she failed? Or are you upset that she even dared to try? Silence. Blake had no answer. Because this was never about Melania's effectiveness. It was about control. It was about the media's obsession with shaping people into what they wanted them to be. And when someone refused to comply, refused to fit into the mold, they were erased. Or worse, ridiculed. And in that moment, Barron Trump made the audience see the hypocrisy. And Jonathan Blake knew he had lost. But the battle wasn't over yet. Because now Barron was about to turn the spotlight onto the media itself. And Jonathan Blake was in for the fight of his career. Jonathan Blake was a seasoned fighter in the media arena. He had built his career on turning losing moments into dramatic comebacks, always finding a way to steer the conversation back into his favor. But this time was different. He could feel it. The shift in the room, the way the audience was no longer seeing him as the one in control. Barron Trump had done something no guest had ever done before. He had made the audience question the media itself. Jonathan could not let that stand. He straightened his tie, forced a tight smile, and leaned in. If he couldn't break Barron with brute force, he'd try something more subtle. He'd make Barron contradict himself, or at the very least, make the audience doubt his stance. You make an interesting argument, Barron, he said, his voice smooth but edged with something sharper. But let's talk about what silence actually means in politics. Let's talk about accountability. Barron didn't flinch. Jonathan pounced. You say your mother wasn't silent, that she chose to stay out of the chaos, he continued. Fine. But when she did speak, when she made Be Best her initiative, wasn't it her responsibility to actually follow through? Barron's eyes narrowed slightly. Jonathan took that as an opening. Cyberbullying is a real issue, Barron, Blake pressed, his voice growing more intense. And yet, your own father was one of the most infamous Twitter users in history. He attacked journalists, mocked political rivals, insulted private citizens. Are you saying your mother's campaign wasn't hypocritical? The audience stirred. There it was, the hook. This was the question that would get Barron on the defensive. If he defended his mother, he'd have to justify why she stayed silent on his father's tweets. If he admitted there was hypocrisy, he'd be admitting the initiative was flawed. A perfect checkmate. Or so Jonathan thought. A slow, deliberate silence filled the room. And then, Barron smiled. Not forced, not fake. A knowing smile. Jonathan felt his stomach tighten. That was not the reaction he expected. Barron leaned back slightly, tapping his fingers against the armrest of his chair before speaking. Jonathan, he said, his voice calm. You've been in the media for, what, 2 decades now? Jonathan blinked. That's right, Barron nodded. Tell me something, he continued, his voice slow, measured. How many times have you personally criticized a politician for something their spouse did? Jonathan hesitated. Barron's gaze sharpened. How many times, Barron repeated, have you called a first lady hypocritical because of her husband's actions? Jonathan opened his mouth, then closed it. The audience knew the answer. Never. Because this wasn't about hypocrisy. It wasn't about cyberbullying. It was about power, about attacking the woman who refused to play by the media's rules. Barron's voice cut through the tension like a blade. My mother didn't run for office. She wasn't elected. She didn't have executive power, he said. And yet, you are holding her responsible for things she had no control over. Jonathan visibly tensed. If that's the standard, Barron continued, tilting his head slightly, then tell me, Jonathan, where were the questions about Michelle Obama when President Obama's drone strikes killed civilians overseas? Where was the outrage when Jill Biden stood by as her husband reversed policies on student loans? Boom. The studio erupted, not in noise, but in silence. a silence that was louder than any argument. Jonathan knew he had lost that round, but he wasn't done fighting. "You're deflecting," Jonathan said quickly, regaining his composure. "This isn't about past first ladies. This is about your mother, about accountability, about the role of women in politics." Barron didn't blink. "You want to talk about the role of women in politics?" he asked. Jonathan nodded. "Yes, because being First Lady is more than just wearing designer dresses and standing beside the president. It's about leadership." And then, Barron Trump delivered the moment that would be replayed across every media outlet in America. "You keep talking about leadership, Jonathan," he said, leaning forward. "But tell me, when did the media ever give my mother a chance to lead?" Jonathan's breath hitched. "You mock her accent," Barron continued. "You mock her fashion choices. You call her names, you imply she's weak, and now, after years of tearing her down, you sit here and ask why she didn't lead?" The audience was no longer on Jonathan's side. Barron wasn't just winning, he was exposing everything. Jonathan scrambled for another pivot. "Public figures will always be criticized, Barron," he said, voice tight. "That's part of the job." "But there's a difference between criticism and character assassination," Barron shot back. "And you know it." Jonathan's lips pressed together, and at that moment, the internet exploded. This interview was going viral. Comment sections lit up, Twitter threads were in flames. People weren't just watching, they were questioning everything they thought they knew about Melania Trump, about media narratives, about who really controls the conversation. And if you're watching right now and you see what's happening, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more hard-hitting content like this. Because we're just getting started. And Jonathan Blake had no idea what was coming next. For the first time in his career, Jonathan Blake felt something he had never experienced on his own show: loss of control. It wasn't just that Barron Trump was answering his questions. It was how he was answering them. Unshaken, unintimidated, calculated. Blake had thrown every trick in the book: manipulative framing, emotional baiting, intellectual traps, but Barron dodged them with ease, and worse, he turned them back against him. And now, as they sat across from each other under the blinding studio lights, everyone in the room could feel the shift. Barron Trump was running this interview now. Blake's last stand. Blake knew he had to do something, anything, to regain control. He couldn't just let this happen. Not on his show. So he did what any cornered interviewer would do. He went for the personal attack. "You know, Barron," Blake said, his voice slow, deliberate, edged with an artificial calm. "It's easy to sit here and talk about the media being unfair. It's easy to point fingers, to say your mother was misunderstood." The tension in the studio tightened. "But let's talk about you." The audience leaned in. Blake saw his opportunity and seized it. "You've lived in privilege your entire life. You've never had to work a day to earn respect. You were born with a last name that gave you everything." Silence. "People don't know who you really are, Barron," Blake continued, his voice growing sharper. "They just see the Trump name, the wealth, the security detail. Tell me, do you really think you've ever had to fight for anything?" The audience murmured. Even those who had been won over by Barron's composure were curious to see how he would react. Blake smirked slightly. He thought he had him now. A privileged kid defending his mother? That was one thing. But proving that he was more than just his last name? That was impossible. Barron's final move, the moment that shocked America. Barron breathed in deeply. And then he did something no one expected. He laughed. Not a nervous chuckle, not an arrogant scoff, a real, genuine laugh. Blake's smirk vanished. The audience sat in stunned silence. And then Barron spoke. "You're right about one thing, Jonathan," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable power. "I was born with a last name that comes with expectations, but let's be clear about something. That last name doesn't defend itself." Blake's jaw tightened. Barron leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "You sit here, night after night, deciding who the public should love, who they should hate. You shape narratives that make or break careers. But tell me something." The air in the room went still. "When was the last time someone let me speak for myself?" Blake's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. "You call me privileged," Barron continued, his voice steady. "But my privilege doesn't protect me from you, from people like you who assume they know who I am before I even say a word." from a media that has spent years defining me before I ever had a chance to define myself." Blake shifted in his chair. "Do you know what that feels like?" Barron asked, his voice quieter now but somehow even stronger. "To be turned into a symbol instead of a person? To have the world decide who you are before you even open your mouth?" The audience was hanging on his every word. Barron leaned back slightly, his posture still composed, still in control. "You ask if I've ever had to fight for anything," he said. "The truth is, I fight every single day." Blake looked rattled. He had spent years crafting narratives about powerful people, exposing their weaknesses, making them answer to his version of reality. But Barron Trump? He had just exposed him. The breaking point. Jonathan Blake loses the war. Blake cleared his throat. "That's a very poetic answer, Barron," he said, his voice strained but trying to maintain professionalism. "But people still wonder, what do you really stand for? Are you just here to defend your mother, or are you actually stepping into the spotlight?" Barron's eyes didn't waver. "I don't need the spotlight," he said. "I need the truth." Boom. The final blow. Blake had nothing left. Because Barron Trump had just done the impossible. He had walked into one of the toughest interviews in America, and walked out, completely undefeated. The crowd erupted. The internet exploded. Barron Trump had just made history. The fallout, a moment that defined an era. Jonathan Blake, for the first time in his career, had been outmatched. The headlines the next morning weren't about how he had exposed Barron Trump. They were about how Barron Trump had exposed the media. And if you're watching right now, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. Because this is the kind of content the mainstream won't show you. Barron Trump didn't just win the interview, he changed the game, and nothing would ever be the same again. The moment the interview ended, the world erupted. Social media platforms went into meltdown. Hashtags like Barron exposed, the media, Blake defeated, and let Barron speak. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube all flooded with clips of the interview, millions of people dissecting every word, every shift in power. Did we just witness the greatest media takedown in history? I never thought I'd say this, but Barron Trump just schooled the media. This isn't just about politics. This is about how they manipulate all of us. For years, the media had controlled the conversation, dictating who was worthy of being heard and who wasn't. But tonight, millions of people saw it for what it really was. A game where the rules only applied to certain people, a game where powerful voices were silenced, twisted, and manipulated, unless they fit the right narrative. And for the first time, the audience wasn't just consuming media, they were questioning it. Jonathan Blake, once the undisputed king of political interviews, was suddenly the subject of scrutiny. People re-watched old clips of his past interviews, comparing tactics, seeing patterns they had never noticed before. The veil had been lifted. Barron Trump hadn't just defended his mother, he had exposed the system itself. And the media? They weren't ready for what came next. If you see what's happening, don't stay silent. Like, comment, and subscribe to keep this conversation going. Let's make sure the truth is louder than the narrative. As the interview came to a close, Barron Trump remained exactly as he had been from the start. Calm, composed, completely unshaken. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to prove anything, because the truth was already out there for the world to see. Jonathan Blake, a man who had built his career by controlling the conversation, by exposing the flaws in others, by twisting narratives to fit his agenda, sat across from Barron, a shadow of his former self. He had thrown everything he had at the youngest Trump, and yet he had lost. Not because Barron shouted, not because he played into the usual political theater, but because he refused to play the game at all. The final question of the night came, almost an afterthought. "Barron," Blake asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of the bravado he had started with, "if you could say one thing to the people watching right now, what would it be?" Barron paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Then, with a quiet confidence that no headline could twist, no media spin could distort, he simply said, "Think for yourself." Boom. A simple statement, but it was everything, because that's what they were afraid of all along, wasn't it? A world where people stopped blindly believing and started questioning. If this interview opened your eyes, hit like, drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. The media doesn't get to decide the truth, you do. And with that, Barron Trump stood, adjusted his suit, and walked off the stage, completely in control. The conversation wasn't over. It was just getting started.